Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our M365 security session, which actually is the last of our sessions this week. So thank you for everyone that's joined us so far, and welcome to any newbies we've got today. Got an exciting session around M365 security. But the reason why we're here for the whole week is to kind of give you a flavor and a feel for the different types of considerations you'll need to make when you're making that cloud journey, whether you're looking at Office 365, whether you're looking at Azure, AWS, cloud applications. We've tried to spread the kind of education over the last 3 days, and hopefully you found that useful. Just to note, there will be recordings of every single session available in the archive of the platform, so feel free to go and watch back the viewings when you can. So for today's session, let me just click through. So just a little bit of housekeeping before today's session. Fire exits are obviously at your house, so you don't need to worry about those too much. There will be a number of polls and questions throughout. There might actually be one on the screen right now. So if you feel free to enter the polls whenever you can, they'll be popping up throughout the speakers, and I will kind of review them and kind of ask the presentations throughout. Please interact on screen in the Q&A box. I'll again collate all those questions and ask the presenters their kind of feelings and thoughts on those as well. And your feedback is encouraged. So please put your comments in the survey box, and there will be kind of a prize draw for a £100 shopping voucher at the end. So quick introduction to ourselves. So my name's Luke Kiernan, Head of Security Alliances at Bytes. So I'm kind of go through the Bytes security division, the kind of where we've come from and our history. And then I'm going to pass over to our two guest speakers for today. So we've got J.Peter from Mimecast and also Mike from Zscaler, kind of talking at two different angles when considering M365 migrations and security. So the Bytes security division. So been around for over 20 years now, and have a history of helping customers right from pre-sales, post-sales, and consultancy around security. We've got a large team of expertise from about 65 security specialists, all with highly accredited certifications. We've got a rounded proposition which we feel is unique in the market, which I'll go into shortly. But we've got a comprehensive experience in the security landscape over 20 years, and our kind of biggest change was last year when we merged two very successful security companies into one, and now we're offering more propositions, more messages, more consultancy to our customers, enabling them to really drive their security strategy forward. So here's our kind of security proposition in one area. I'll just go through the 4 or 5 bubbles that are on the screen right now, starting with our cyber consulting division, which is headed up by our CISO, Steve Marshall. This looks at everything outside of security solutions. So when you're looking at penetration testing, security audits, incident response or breach forensics, we can help in all these different areas. We're part of the ISF security framework, so we can advise on a lot of different compliancy frameworks and benchmark you against your peers. Moving on to our procurement services. So our solution selling team is very experienced. We're kind of top tier vendor across most of the vendors in the landscape, which gives commercial advantage, but also technical advantage and technical reach. And we come at it from an agnostic viewpoint, so we can give you really comprehensive understanding of what is best fit and what kind of wouldn't be best fit for your challenges and your strategy. Our professional services team and our support desk team, very skilled engineers, minimum 5 years experience. Our 24/7 support desk is direct to third line engineer, so very unique. When you're picking up the phone to our support desk engineers, you know that engineer can remotely connect to you and fix that issue rather than passing it on to another engineer to solve. And our professional services team also man a support desk. So you know when you're speaking to someone in our team, they can really help you drive that problem or challenge forward quickly. And then our managed services division, which we're seeing as a key driver in the landscape at the moment. So we can offer 24/7 SOC, NOC, MDR, managed firewall, managed IPS, and a host of other managed services, which we're seeing as a key driver in the industry today. let's build that out. So just before I pass over to J.Peter from Mimecast, just want to give you a kind of brief synopsis of what the presenters may go through. So from an M365 security point of view, M365 is kind of the most adopted productivity platform in the world. It's a great platform to use. Everyone pretty much uses it, but it also means it's also one of the largest attack vectors in the world. And from a Bytes point of view, we talk around, when we're talking with customers around email, it's at a layered approach. So whether you're using Microsoft native tools from a security point of view, we really need to layer that, because the attackers are effectively going after the email gateway, the email solution, in order to get into a customer's environment. And the stat that we kind of see quite often is over 90% of cyber attacks do start with an email, and they're becoming more and more sophisticated. So all of the different controls on the screen you'll see today is kind of hopefully the baseline of where you need to be at. And then we can, J.Peter will go into a little bit more detail around that on his presentation. And then from when Mike comes on from Zscaler, so more from an optimization point of view and a still security angle as well. Obviously, with what happened over the past sort of year, most companies have turned from one office with 100 people to now 100 branch offices, where everyone's very remote. And there's lots of considerations to think about there, not just security, but also performance and total cost of ownership, and really making it simplistic for the IT team to manage that breadth of remote users. Bytes had to do ourselves as well. So it's a real consideration that Mike is going to go into and hopefully kind of give you some insight on how to resolve that. So I think we had a quick poll just now, and sounds like most people are awake after lunch, so that's good. And most people are drinking tea at the moment, so all good. Maybe too many coffees this morning, but yeah, thanks for your time this morning. I'm going to be in and out with the Q&A after the presenters, but over to J.Peter.
Greetings. It's great to be with you folks today. I'm excited to talk to you about the subject at hand, which is really revolving around cyber hygiene with M365. We've heard a lot about hygiene over the last year or so, and it's it's kind of an interesting subject when you think about it from the M365 perspective. We're going to talk a little bit about where things are at in the Microsoft world, what Microsoft provides to give us cyber hygiene tools, and then where we can look to third parties to see if we can bolster that. So before we get into all of that, allow me to introduce myself. My name is J.Peter Bruzzese. I'm an 8-time awarded Microsoft MVP, originally for Exchange Server and then for Office 365 and then Office servers and services from 2010 to 2019. So for those folks who aren't aware as to what this is, it's actually an award that Microsoft gives to individuals who are leaders in various technical community buckets. Mine happened to be email with Exchange Server for many years. And then eventually Microsoft convinced me to move that thinking to the online world. And I'm glad I did, because as you can see, it really has become the de facto standard and platform for folks to use for their email. As you can see here on the slide, I'm also co-founder of cliptraining.com, which is a provider of Windows, Office, and Office 365 training videos through portals. I've done a bunch of other things. I'm a journalist. I'm a technical speaker for Microsoft and others. And last but not least, I'm a technical consultant and tech evangelist for Mimecast. And so the reason for that is because when I looked at the landscape as I was shifting from Exchange on-prem to the cloud, I knew that we needed to have additional solutions in place to bolster what Microsoft provides, to enhance it. This was always the case with on-premises Exchange, that we had an ecosystem that surrounded it. And so in the move to the cloud, I looked to see where I can bolster what Exchange provides out of the box and what M365 provides. So with that in mind, let's look at our key takeaways for today. There we go. So first of all, we're going to talk about recommendations to strengthen Office 365 or M365 utilizing best practices. We're going to give some thoughts from CISA, which is in the United States, the Homeland Security Cybersecurity Division. We'll talk about cyber kill chain focus points from the gateway to the end user. We'll talk about zone defense and offense strategy, going beyond the traditional perimeter. So these are the key takeaways. Let's jump right into a discussion of M365 and where things are at. So I don't think there's any doubt that we would all agree that Microsoft's Office 365, now Microsoft 365 solution is just exploding. Years ago, if I was in front of an audience of, let's say, 300 people, I would ask and I would say, how many of you are moving to Office 365? And I might get a few hands. But for the most part, people were staying on premises. And we've seen that shift. And then with the pandemic, we've seen it shift even faster. In fact, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, he said, we've seen 2 years worth of digital transformation in 2 months. And what he means by that is, of course, we're seeing the numbers of people jump to M365, not just for email, but especially now for Teams. We've seen that number just explode. So Microsoft is definitely meeting the needs of people at this time, and we appreciate that. However, at the same time, we might say, well, is that all good? Well, so that's where the cybersecurity division comes into play. So the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, they issued an alert at the beginning of the pandemic because they started to see that people were rushing to Office 365 and they weren't necessarily doing it in the smartest way. There were things that were missing, maybe because they were caught off guard, perhaps because they weren't aware of all of the different solutions that were available or in play. And so they put out a list of suggestions to try to assist. And we're going to go through these now with you, just to make sure that from a cybersecurity perspective, from a cyber hygiene perspective, you're aware of what you should be doing with what's built in to M365. So for example, number one on the list was using multi-factor authentication. The CISA cybersecurity division, they feel that this is something that's often ignored. And part of the reason for that is because many may not even know that it's built right into M365. You can turn on multi-factor authentication for your admins. You can turn on multi-factor authentication for your entire organization. And in fact, that connects directly to what's called a secure score. So the secure score looks at best practices from Microsoft's perspective, and it looks to see where you rate along the meter of best practices. Most organizations are pretty low, and that's because they're not using things like multi-factor authentication. So that's number one on the list of things that you might ponder. If you're not running multi-factor authentication, give that some thought. It's built into M365. The next point on the cybersecurity list was ensuring the principle of least privilege was being used. Now, this is actually not a new concept. This is something that we typically see with on-premises environments, being diligently followed, hopefully. But when you move to Office 365, here's one of the challenges that we find. Especially if you're not used to working with so many different server types that are now cloud-based, and you get frustrated where people can't do what they're supposed to be able to do, what ends up happening is you just start assigning them higher rights. You take their accounts and you make them higher level privileges. You assign them roles that are higher than where they should be. We find organizations that have many, many global admins in the organization. And that's odd because they're small organizations, but it just became the easiest way perhaps to give people what they needed, whatever permissions they needed. So, okay, you did that perhaps. And you were in the middle of putting out fires, and so you didn't have a choice. But go back and look to see that people have only what they need in your environment, because all of that extra privilege, yes, it may allow them to do their job, but it's also putting your environment at risk. That's not necessarily the best thing. The third point was to enable audit logging. Now you can do this through the Security and Compliance Center. Personally, I think that you have to have reasons to turn on audit logging, and you have to know what you're logging, what you're looking for. So there's a variety of different things that you might want to do there. I recently enabled audit logging, looking at users for a short period of time. I was looking for something specific, and then I was pulling that information using a very simple PowerShell script that would allow me to then see it in a spreadsheet and see if I had any issues that might make me, or red flags that might make me concerned. So that's not hard to do. And with a little bit of research, you can find what you need in order to make that happen. So audit logging on its own is one piece of it. You can also, with audit logging, Microsoft does provide some basic reporting But if you want a more robust look at that data, you're going to have to look to PowerShell to pull it. So just something to ponder. The next is alerting, right? Similar to auditing, you want to make sure that you're alerted when there are issues. Microsoft has some basic alerting that you can enable. And then the last thing is disabling legacy email protocols. This is something that Microsoft has been talking about for quite some time, that the basic authentication was going to be going away, but a lot of folks have not looked to disable it just yet. So these were the reports from the cybersecurity division, and they're worth considering. They're worth pondering. So you might say, okay, that's great. I'll think about that, J.Peter. I'll think about multi-factor authentication and some of these others. What else do you have? So those are the built-in things that Microsoft provides. Where else do we go from here? If I'm thinking about cyber hygiene, what else can I do to protect my environment? Well, okay, let's talk about that. So here's another thing that we find is not being taken advantage of: SPF, DKIM, and Dmarc. It's a funny thing because these acronyms and sometimes the descriptions, when you read them online, they might overwhelm you a bit. They make it very complicated. What's doing encryption, and where does DNS fit in, and how does Dmarc work? And it's a triangulation of the two. It's not as complicated as you might think. So let's just break it down. So SPF, this is something that actually many organizations do have in place. This authenticates the sender of an email, and it does that through a DNS record, right? That's first of all. Then you have DKIM. This gives emails a signature header that's added to the email and secured with encryption. And you say, well, how do I do that? Here's the thing. Microsoft makes this very easy if you're using M365. They actually give you the exact PowerShell codes, and they give you the directions. It takes all of 15 minutes to accomplish. So it takes longer to read and understand DKIM than it does to actually enable it. Microsoft makes enabling DKIM very easy. The SPF side, that comes with knowing what people in your organization are sending emails. Are they using things like SendGrid or some other solution? And then making sure that you have all of that in your SPF record. But once you have those things in place, and many organizations don't, after that, you want to look at Dmarc, because what Dmarc does is it allows you to take those two pieces, SPF and DKIM, triangulate them, and then allows you to give direction to email servers that says, hey, if an email comes in, and especially from a domain spoofing perspective, if an email comes in and it doesn't match the SPF and DKIM settings that we are recommending in our records, well, then drop it. You can say quarantine it, you can say reject it. So you can decide what you want them to do with that message. But ultimately, you now have control over domain spoofing emails that are being sent, possibly with your name attached. So this is something that I think a lot of folks are not looking at yet, and they should, because it's not all that expensive to implement. The one thing, however, is that even though Dmarc is an amazing solution with the triangulation and all of that, you can set it up and not have an analyzer, and then you won't see the results of your hard labor. So it's really good to have a Dmarc analyzing solution. For example, Mimecast has Dmarc Analyzer. And what this does is it allows you to see the actual results of emails being quarantined. How many are they being quarantined? How many are being rejected? What countries are sending these emails and such? It'll give you a little bit more insight in terms of what's happening in your environment. Let's talk for a little bit more about email as a threat. Yes, we've talked about domain spoofing, and again, I definitely recommend SPF, DKIM, and Dmarc. But when we look at email and we look at the cyber kill chain, a lot of times folks will say to me, J.Peter, where should I put the majority of my effort and attention with regard to security? There's so many different aspects of that cyber kill chain, everything from the gateway through to the endpoint. And yes, all of those need your consideration. To some degree, however, we want to look at how much budget do we have. Obviously, we can't buy everything. And would that be overkill in the sense of, do you want to have multiple solutions that do exactly the same thing? I get asked that question a lot too. Am I not just buying multiple solutions that do exactly the same thing? Well, that would be foolish. So no, you don't want to do that. But you do want to look at the entire cyber kill chain. However, often I'm asked the question, what if I only have a reasonable budget, a minimum budget, but I don't necessarily have enough to focus on everything? Where should I focus most of my attention? And that's a good question, because they're not all equal. So I typically put three things in place. First of all, I say the gateway. Why? Because 90+% of all attacks start with some kind of a phish. That's just the basic statistics. Some say 94%, which you can see here on the slide. Some say, I even saw in the Wall Street Journal, I saw 97%. So if that's the case, then that's where you want to focus your time and attention, is the gateway. You want to prevent anything nasty from coming in right there at the gateway before it even gets to your Exchange environment, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, right? That just makes sense. The second thing I tell folks to look at is, okay, well then what about the other 10% or so? You need to look at your human firewall. You need to look at your users, make sure that they have solid awareness training. I say vigilant training. Like they need to be more than just aware. They need to be vigilant about cybersecurity. But then on top of it, you have your endpoints. And then also you need to make sure everything in between is taken care of. So it's a lot. It's a lot put on your shoulders. We get it. But again, the gateway is where we see the biggest problems. So if that's the case, we need to focus on that. But if we go back to the question of, am I not just paying the same, for the same solution? Am I not just creating redundant solutions in my environment? Is that, it's a good question. I was actually, I was on a stage in South Africa last year, and this question came my way, and they said, J.Peter, I have Microsoft 365, and I'm also looking at third-party solutions like Mimecast. Would I not be basically just doubling down on the same thing? Microsoft says they have all the security built in. It's a good question. So here's how I like to describe it. I like to describe it as fences, and all fences are not equal. So Microsoft provides the best, I say it's the best communication, collaboration, and cooperation suite in the history of mankind, to date, at least. And I love what we have with Teams, with Exchange Online, and all of those features. It's brilliant. However, they build homes, and they've built us an amazing home, an amazing tenant. They call them tenants for a reason. And so we have our tenants in M365, and our users live within that tenant. But what Microsoft has not been doing for a very long time is building fences. So prior to this, Exchange Server didn't have a security solution really built in. There were some anti-spam agents, and you had an edge transport server, and then they eventually added an antivirus solution that typically you turned off. But for the most part, they stayed out of the security game. So this opportunity for them to look and provide fencing, it's a good one. And Microsoft is working on that. So they have Exchange Online Protection, which I liken to a 2-foot picket fence that surrounds your property. It'll keep the critters out. It's basic anti-spam, anti-malware. It won't protect you from any type of opportunistic attacks or targeted attacks. And that's because even Microsoft doesn't claim that it has anything built in for attachment protection or URL destination scanning protection, none of that. It's your basic anti-spam, anti-malware 2-foot picket fence. Then Microsoft offers one other option. You can purchase either a la carte or with E5 licensing their 4 to 5 foot fence. It's more like a shadow box fence. This is advanced threat protection, and now it's called Defender for 365. So this provides some attachment protection. There's a sandboxing solution. This provides some destination scanning of the URLs, not deep real-time destination scanning. It doesn't go beyond the initial page, but they provide some of the basics here that can provide protection against opportunistic attacks and perhaps even some targeted attacks. Okay, so that's great. The minute you have to now start looking at that, you say, well, what do they have after that? Well, they don't have anything after that. But what if you want more than that? What if you want more protection for your tenant? Well, in that case, you're going to have to go to a third party. And you could see there in the cartoon, it's a 10-foot iron or aluminum or titanium fence or whatever metal you choose. And then barbed wire, video cameras, sentinels, the whole thing. There's guard dogs on the other side of it too. So you say, okay, J.Peter, I love cartoons as much as the next person, and I see the point, fences, I get it. But can we look at some data that actually backs up this concept that all fences are not equal? Well, yeah, that's easy. Let's look at some of the data around at least one of these points. Let's talk about attachment protection. Attachment protection is just one thing. We could talk about things like impersonation protection. We could talk about URL link protection. We could talk about internal email protection. We could do all of those, but we don't have the time today. So I picked this one because it clearly illustrates the 3 fences. Now, in terms of attachment protection, ransomware, malware, these types of attacks with an attachment. The attachment comes in. If it's a weaponized attachment, you want your attachment-based protection solution to block it. Okay, EOP, how does it do? Well, EOP doesn't have attachment protection, and Microsoft doesn't claim that it does. So EOP is kind of out of the box already. Like I said, 2-foot picket fence keeps the critters out. It does not protect you from an attachment issue. But Advanced Threat Protection, or Defender for 365, does have a sandboxing solution. So the email comes in, it goes into their Azure VM. So it's a software-based sandboxing solution, which I don't have anything against sandboxes. I prefer hardware emulated sandboxes, and there's a reason for that. I think that the type of solution explains the efficacy level. We find is that Microsoft's attachment protection solution sometimes doesn't catch the attachment if it's a weaponized attachment. Sometimes it allows it to pass. And part of the reason I believe is because the hardware emulated sandboxing solution does a better job of tricking the attachment into believing it's in a real environment. When you're using a software emulated attachment protection solution, if the malware wakes up in an environment, and I personify it a bit, sorry, I think of it as a live thing. When it wakes up in an environment, if it can detect that it's in a sandbox, it remains dormant. So that's not as good as having a solution that can truly trick it, a hardware emulated solution. But I digress. So Microsoft provides this software-based VM. It opens up the attachment, and if it can see if it detonates, then it won't pass it forward. Okay, that's fine. Again, I'm not anti-sandboxing, but when we look at third-party solutions like Mimecast, Mimecast provides a sandboxing solution as well. They're a lot more transparent about what it does. With Microsoft, you can't really see what's going on under the hood, but with Mimecast, it's a hardware emulated sandboxing solution. They use AV signatures, heuristics, time incrementation, and ultimately, it's not the only solution. Mimecast also has a static file analysis solution where what it does is it looks at the bits and bytes of a document, the zeros and ones, to see if there's any executable code. I mean, if you have an email that comes in with an image attached that has executable code, that should set off some red flags somewhere. We shouldn't have to sandbox that. You should see, hey, there's a problem right away. And that's the nice thing about it, is that because it's static, it doesn't require that you go to the sandbox right away. It automatically can red flag that, and it's file agnostic. So whether it's a PDF or a Word document and so forth. Mimecast also has a solution where they convert documents, let's say from a Word document to a PDF. That conversion eradicates ransomware and malware 100%. It can't survive the conversion process. It's just basic science there, that the conversion kills it. So if you're like me, most documents that you receive, you just need to read. You don't necessarily need to edit. So having that conversion to PDF is brilliant. And then if I need the original, I can request it. It can be looked at through the static file analyzer. It can be sent through the hardware emulated sandbox, and I'm good to go. So again, it just goes to show you the difference between a 2-foot, 4, 5-foot, and 10-foot fence in terms of the types of solutions that are in play and why I actually break them up that way. Okay, so we've talked a lot about this. Let's move forward and talk a little bit about the zones that we mentioned at the beginning, how to look at security from a zone perspective. So a lot of times folks only look at the outside zone. They only look at the perimeter, but we need to do better than that. We need to look inside our organization and beyond the perimeter. This is where we need to look at solutions that fit into each of these. So at the perimeter, we just talked about having a secure gateway solution, targeted threat protection, data loss protection. These are important. Inside the organization, we're looking at internal email protection, awareness training, which we discussed a little bit earlier, quarantine and remediation and such, so that you prevent lateral spread. And then beyond the perimeter, we talked a little bit about brand and domain protection, right? We talked about DKIM and SPF, and then Dmarc and having an analyzer. We also want to look at things that can protect us in terms of our brand by being able to scour the internet to see that we're not being misused, global threat intelligence, and so on. And then taking advantage of existing investments. That's where APIs come into play as well. And this is all something that Mimecast focuses on in order to ensure that they can cover all of the different zones, as opposed to just focusing on one zone, which is, very 1990s of us if we're just focused on that perimeter. But these days, we need to focus on everything. Before we move forward, I think we're going to have a poll question. Let's have that poll question put up for you folks. All right. Very good. For those of you who are answering the questions, just so you know, I can't see the questions. So, but I wrote it. So I'm looking forward to hearing your responses.
Whilst we wait for those to come through, should we just, I can let you know when they come through, J.Peter.
Excellent. So while that's happening, I will move forward. Let's continue on. Let's talk for a minute about something that a lot of folks don't really want to talk about right now, but we have to address it eventually. And that is the Hafnium attacks. So look, here's what happened. Microsoft has had Exchange Server on-prem for 20 plus years. Over the last, I guess, since Exchange 2010 forward, so the last 10 years, there's been an exploit available that no one has taken advantage of until now. Microsoft found out about this in January. It took them a couple of months before they put out the patches. Some have criticized that response time. That's not my job to criticize. It's a hack, and the bad guys took advantage of it. And what had to happen after that was patching and remediation. That's bad. During that time, of course, servers had to be taken offline. And so it created, for some environments, unplanned downtime of their Exchange on premises. Some folks have said that, you know, this is what's going to lead them towards moving to M365 permanently. That's your choice. But ultimately, it happened. So what this tells me is that it can happen. Knowing that, again, makes me more concerned about other things. Granted, this was on-prem, not online, but it still helps me to appreciate that going with a single solution to protect myself and my environment may not always be the best choice. Not only that, but having solutions that can allow for continuity, that also is valuable to me. So that's where I look to both in order to not just be secure, but to be able to work and continue to work in a secure environment as I move forward. Did we get those responses yet?
Not quite.
Oh, okay. All right. That's okay. Take your time, folks. So the other thing I want to talk about beyond Hafnium is just continuity in general, because yes, with the Hafnium attack, maybe that caused unplanned downtime for your organization. We get it. And you had to work on that. But in addition, you also had a situation where, Exchange Online, although it wasn't affected, it is affected because to date, if you have, let's say you've moved your environment to Office 365, you still have to have at least one Exchange server on-prem. And that's because there's an issue between the Azure AD and Exchange Online communication that is different from the way it works on-prem. On-prem, Active Directory and Exchange talk to each other. You can update attributes and such with regard to your Exchange environment, and it will update in Active Directory. Works fine. There's something not quite right between Active Directory Online or Azure AD and Exchange Online. And as a result of that, organizations that have moved their mailboxes to the cloud continue to have servers on-prem, at least one. So this idea, I'm going to move everything to the cloud, this Hafnium attack is what is going to, push me in that direction. Okay, you can do that. And I encourage you to do that. I think that's a good move. In some cases, organizations can't do that still. They still require that on-prem environment. And I understand that too. But no matter what, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, you can have an outage. This Hafnium attack shows that you can have an unplanned downtime scenario where you're patching for a period of time. And you need to make sure people can still send and receive email. How do you do that? You also need to make sure they remain secure. You need to make sure that they remain compliant. How do you do that? Well, that's where, again, a solution like Mimecast, they have a continuity solution that includes its own MTA. And ultimately, with a situation like this, your people could continue to send and receive email as if nothing had happened. And then ultimately, once your servers are back up online, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, you can flip the switch and ultimately your people can keep working as if nothing had happened. That's the beauty of a solution like that. You don't want your people to worry about it. And so ultimately, it allows for unplanned outages or downtime. M365 has outages. Sometimes I say it goes down in whole, in parts, and in pieces. Sometimes it goes down in whole. That's when you have an Azure AD or an Azure DNS issue and nobody can access anything. There was a global outage not too long ago, a couple of weeks back, but typically it affects a zone, not the globe. But yeah, there was a global outage that affected Teams and other things. So it goes down in whole, it goes down in parts, which is where Teams is out or Exchange Online is out, something like that. And then it goes down in pieces. So for example, a couple of times, MFA was out. And so I just encourage you to use MFA, and I still believe that's a good option. However, make sure you have a break the glass account. Make sure that you at least have one account that can turn MFA off. It's a bit of a light switch. It's easy to turn off. Make sure you have the ability to do that in the event there's an outage, because there have been some outages of MFA. And unfortunately, when that piece breaks, it's not like, oh, it's a small piece, it doesn't matter, and we can keep working. But when people can't actually authenticate, then again, that's a bigger problem. So what do you do when you have these unplanned outages or unplanned downtime? In those cases, having a continuity solution, which is something Microsoft can't provide for itself, ultimately that will allow your people not only to keep working, which often they'll do anyway, they'll just switch to another form of email, they'll go to shadow IT solutions. That's not what you want. You want them to keep working, but remain under your protective umbrella. You want them to continue to use the security and the compliance or archiving solutions that you have in place. So that's where looking to a third-party solution like Mimecast can be very helpful in that regard. Okay, I'm sure by now we've gotten some of those answers in. Let's hear them.
Yeah, we do. So nearly half of our viewers are currently using MFA, which is great.
Great.
The next kind of biggest usage is AIP, and then Dmarc, DKIM, and SPF are all pretty much the same, but around 4 to 8% of our users.
Wow. Okay, that is really good to know. So then that tells me that already, hopefully, I have had an impact today. That if you're listening, hopefully this gives you an opportunity to revisit MFA, DKIM, Dmarc, and look at those solutions again. As well as look at other solutions that you might be using or thinking about using with regard to security and now continuity. Before we move forward to the next piece, which is on archive or compliance, let's throw out another poll question. This one you have to answer a little bit faster because we don't have the time to to go through multiple slides. I only have one left. So let's throw that poll question out. And then while we're doing that, I will move forward and we'll look at archive. Excellent. So the audience, you guys can see this. You can see the poll question now. And so answer that quickly. And what I'll do is I'll move into the next discussion point, cloud archive. And then hopefully by the time I'm finished with this piece in 2 minutes or so, then we'll be able to hear your responses. So cloud archive, how does that come into play with regard to cyber hygiene? How does it come into play with regard to just this entire discussion, really? Well, remember, data is it's essential for various compliance and legislation and regulations that exist. In a GDPR world, we need to make sure we have the ability to prove that we have taken good care of the data that we have, and also that we can purge data that perhaps has been requested legally to be purged from the system, right to be forgotten, things of that sort. So data is very, it's become a very big subject these days. And having multiple fat repositories of data can be problematic. So for example, with Exchange Online, if you want to retain data, Microsoft provides an archive solution that basically is legal hold or in-place hold. So all of the mail gets retained with the mailbox, and it bloats that mailbox and bloats that mailbox, and it basically makes it to a point where all of that data is just held right there with the mailbox. Whereas typically, I recommend that we separate that and we put the archive in a separate repository that's protected and allows the mailbox to run lean, because that's typically where we see better performance out of our Exchange mailboxes, out of Outlook and so forth. Historically, when mailboxes bloat to a certain point, we have performance issues. Not to mention, there are often performance issues with regard to the indexing and then the responses for e-discovery of the archive when it's mixed in with the mailbox. So what other things should we keep in mind? Well, first of all, I like to remind folks that Microsoft does not do a backup of your email data. So there's no point in time restoration of mailbox items. There is the ability for you to have, it's called native data protection, where there is multiple passive copies of that data. And so that's good. But ultimately, there's no way, in the event your data was lost in some way, someone deleted it, let's say you weren't using the archive solution, if it's deleted permanently, then it would be gone forever. That's it. There is no restore. So you need to think about a backup restore solution, perhaps. You need to think about solutions that can keep your archive separate. I'm going to just ask to see if we've got the poll questions back in at this point.
Yes, we do.
Excellent.
So just reading through the responses, most of them are referring to unknown or short-term outages, so nothing really related. But then the next biggest one is around the Hafnium attack, so the patching, the mitigation of that, and close behind it is the Azure AD DNS outage.
Yes. Oh, that's good to know. It's not a slight against Microsoft that there were outages or there have been outages, or these things do happen to every organization and to every cloud-based organization. It happens. The question isn't so much who to blame, it's how to mitigate it so that these things don't affect your organization going forward. Can you do anything to improve the story? And the answer is yes. Certainly, again, as we talked about, email is a massive threat. Now, the Hafnium attack was not an email-borne attack, so that those two don't necessarily connect. But ultimately, you always have to be prepared to patch those servers. I knew one organization that had over 100 servers that they had to patch immediately. And because they were prepared, they were able to do it in 24 hours. I'm not lying. 24 hours, they had all of their servers patched. So a global organization, 100 servers, that's crazy, but they were prepared. And so that's where you need to make sure that you're prepared in that regard. And so that's why the goal today was to talk about everything from what Microsoft has built into M365 to best practices overall, even talking about the concept of least privileged, which is, again, not new. It's more of a mindset than an actual physical tool. But to talk about all of those things, along with email security, looking at third-party solutions for things like email security, archive, continuity, the value of doing that, and also the value of looking at what I call an all-in-one, that is a solution that can provide the best of these pieces all at the same time. Because whereas in the past with Exchange on-prem, you might have multiple solutions in play around Exchange Server as an ecosystem. With M365, you don't want to daisy chain multiple solutions onto the front end of it. It adds to points of failure. It adds to latency of email delivery and such. So you really want an all-in-one that can provide that security, archive, and continuity angle and enhance what M365 has given you out of the box. Okay, so I'm going to get off my soapbox for a minute here. I'm just curious if there's any questions that have come in that I can answer before turning things over.
Yes, we do. So whilst we're stuck on the Hafnium attack, there's a question around this, and kind of, do you see more and more organizations abandoning on-premise now this has occurred and moving straight to Office 365 sooner than expected?
I have heard that. I have seen that, organizations talking about that, okay, they're done. They're going to move now. Do I actually believe that that is the proper response to this particular attack? No, because Exchange Server for many years did not have this attack. The exploits were there, but they weren't being taken advantage of. So the fact that now someone found these zero-day vulnerabilities, okay, that's bad. And Microsoft provided patches a little late in the game. It took them a couple of months to get those patches out. So there's some negative concepts there. But ultimately, I think that if you're moving to M365, great. But I hope you have a better reason than the fact that on-premises Exchange just let you down. Because if that's your motivation, you're going to be let down in M365 too. There are going to be outages. There are going to be issues. So hopefully you have better reasoning than that. And maybe you were already leaning that way, and now you're all in.
Perfect, thank you. Another question around M365 and the capabilities it has. Do you ever see it get to a stage where it has enterprise-grade options that compete with the likes of Mimecast around security, archiving, continuity? Do you ever see it get into that stage?
That's a great question, actually. So Microsoft doesn't have an unending supply of developers. When I've gone up for the summits as an MVP, they've made that very clear. That's why when we complain, hey, some things are missing, they say, we don't have an unending supply of developers. We're very busy. And we like to joke back and say, yes, you're very busy working on Teams. It's obvious that you have a lot of developers for Teams, but why can't we get this server thing worked out with Azure AD and Exchange Online? Why do we have to have an on-prem server still? So to answer your question, do I believe that they have the ability to do that? Yes. Do I believe that's their primary focus? Sometimes. In some cases, that's not their primary focus. Maybe they will eventually focus their attention on security, on archive. But right now, their security solutions are improving slowly over time. But enterprise-grade solutions are improving at a faster pace because they are laser focused on that one subject. They're not trying to create Xbox and Flight Simulator and Windows and Exchange Online, and they're not that divided. They are laser focused. Security, that's what they eat, sleep, drink. That's what they do when they wake up in the morning and they think about security. So do I think Microsoft has the ability to get there with enterprise-grade solutions of that sort? Yes. However, I don't think that's their primary focus at this time. And so when that happens, if that happens, then I'll have to revisit where their solutions are and where those fences are really, as far as how high are those fences? Are they getting closer to the third-party fence? But at this current time, I don't see that.
Great. So there's no additional questions in the chat box. So J.Peter, thanks for your time. Really insightful as always. And yeah, what we're going to do now, we're going to pass straight over to Mike from Zscaler. But once again, J.Peter, thanks for your time.
Happy to be with you folks.
Thanks, Luke. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for staying involved for all afternoon. I know it's often difficult after lunch. I believe I'm the last session of the day, so I'm the last thing standing between you guys and a pint or a glass of wine or a gin and tonic. So we'll keep this relatively rapid. My name's Mike Beaver. I am a practice build consultant at Zscaler. I work with our partner organizations like Bytes to help with their strategy and their go-to-market and espouse all things Zscaler along the way. What we're going to have a quick look at today is 4 best practices from Microsoft around Office 365 deployments and how that is really affected by this new cloud world and this new way that we're all living. So, just to give you an idea of how busy Microsoft is, this is a graphic I pulled a couple of days ago from the Zscaler Trust Portal. So the Zscaler Trust Portal looks at all aspects of the Zscaler cloud, and we categorize our traffic. Now, this is 6 months data, and we have 2 trillion transactions going through the Zscaler cloud into Office 365. So we're really quite staggering how much traffic Office 365 creates. It is, as J.Peter said, the most important productivity and collaboration app of this era. And I think it will stay that way. I'm in full agreement with him on that point. It is, however, very thirsty. And with that in mind, we need to make sure that all of our users have a wonderful experience. Or what you'll find is they'll start bypassing and they'll start involving other ways of accessing that content if they're not getting the experience they expect. Now, users have become more literate over the last few years, and they are now dangerous enough to know how to bypass. However, they are not educated well enough yet to understand the dangers in doing so. So, back in 2019, so even pre-pandemic, we surveyed a number of organizations in conjunction with Tech Validate, and we asked them about their Office 365 deployments and the performance therein. And what we found was that, frankly, everyone was having Office 365 performance issues. Network congestion was the primary culprit here, but then also things like MPLS backhauling. So already those remote users pulling information back in and hairpinning that through a data center out to the M365 cloud and all the way back again was already affecting performance. Over half of those organizations also experienced those network performance on a daily basis. sometimes even multiple times a day. And you can only imagine how frustrating that is for the users that who are trying to do their jobs on a daily basis and make the company they work for successful. And again, this is pre-pandemic. This is pre-pandemic when people were still in offices. They were still sat as close to those perimeter appliances and that perimeter protection as they could be, not when they had suddenly distributed from one office with one data center and one connection to 1,000 or 10,000 offices with 10,000 different connections, and home offices and coffee shops when we're allowed, and hotels and things along those lines. And organizations aren't going to change. In fact, nationwide, Building Society came out today and said 13,000 of their users are now going to be allowed to work from wherever they want. I'm imagining the nationwide CIO is probably a little bit upset right now and trying to figure out how on earth he's going to create that consistent and secure user experience to enable those staff to do their jobs. So as a result of all of this, 63%, almost 2/3 of the respondents, told us that Office 365 collaboration is suffering because of these issues. So what does Microsoft say? Microsoft says 4 things, and we're going to look at each of these in a little more detail in the remaining 25 minutes that we have. So first of all, Microsoft says egress network connections locally, which makes sense. Take the shortest route to the data. Don't worry about going all the way back to a data center and all the way out again. Start thinking about getting that user to the data and to the application as quickly as humanly possible, as quickly as physically possible, I guess. The second thing is have a think about your proxies and have a think about bypassing those. And what I mean by that is don't trombone all of the IP stacks of all of the appliances you have in your perimeter. That's not effective. A lot of the M365 and O365 applications like Skype and Teams and SharePoint Online were designed for very low latency connections, minimal latency to give a good experience. Okay, hairpinning up and down IP stacks inside of appliances is going to kill your performance. Thirdly, split out office traffic. It sounds really common sense, but it is one of those things that you need to do. Office traffic is unlike anything else. It uses every port and every protocol ad nauseum, repeatedly, and it is thirsty for connections. So make sure you split that out and manage that traffic in a way that prioritizes it and keeps those users happy. And then finally, avoid those hairpins. That's not just the proxy-based hairpins, that is also the hairpins of backhauling to a data center and going out again. And just wherever possible in that network chain, see if we can keep those hairpins to a minimum, because it simply doesn't benefit us. And that can even include going out to a destination cloud first and then having to backhaul and access an Office 365 data center. So let's have a look at these in a little more detail. So let's talk about egressing network connections. Well, as Microsoft quite rightly says, shortening the network path to Office 365 by allowing client traffic to egress as close as possible to the geographic location can improve connectivity, performance, and end user experience in Office 365. It's a long-winded quote for saying get the user there as quick as possible, but it's entirely true. Where Zscaler has a real benefit here is using the Zscaler client connector. That client connector is geo-aware and policy-aware in 2 ways, so security context aware. In the first way, we know where the user is, so we can connect them to the closest Microsoft point of presence. Office 365 has 100 data centers spread all around the world. In fact, there's a handy map of all of them. So one of our users in the US, based in Houston, was sat and they were working away quite merrily, and they were backhauling to Ohio in Columbus, which is kind of somewhere up here. They were then traversing across to New York to access the Office 365 data center in New York, and then coming all the way back again to Houston. They turned on the zClient connector, connected to the Zscaler cloud, and the Zscaler cloud went, oh, you're in Houston. Just connect you to Dallas. Everything's fine. So all of a sudden, things got better, things got quicker, and that user experience improved, and the shadow IT went away. So that's a very important part of egressing those network connections locally. Now, the second way in which Zscaler's client connector is aware is it is aware of what network it connects to, and therefore what policy should be applied to it. Zscaler is entirely policy driven. So if the user does happen to be in the office that one day a week, we can be aware of that and we can apply a certain set of policies to that user. If they happen to be at home in their home network, a slightly less trusted network, then we can apply a different set of policies there. And third and finally, if they happen to be, when we're finally allowed, back in a coffee shop or in a hotel, then we can apply an untrusted network set of policies there. So very, very aware. It is all about being contextually aware when it comes to security. And that's what we provide. So where we look at this is that hub and spoke really is the wrong network model. And that's not just for Office 365, but that's for any SaaS-based application. That's for really any cloud-based application, whether it's your own workloads running in Azure or GCP or AWS, or whether that is a SaaS application like Salesforce or Office 365. The reason for that is that low latency that we spoke about. The other reason for that is that everything has shifted. Everything's moved. Okay, my applications aren't in my data center anymore. They're up in AWS. My users aren't even in the office anymore. They're all at home. And I'm consuming IT in a SaaS model. So I'm not even looking after the infrastructure that comes from. So why am I bothering to protect this perimeter that I've created around my office? Or why am I bothering to put so many appliances in that perimeter anyway and build a nice high wall? So really that hub and spoke model is the wrong reason. So backhauling that traffic and pushing it back out really doesn't work particularly well. We'll come on to VPNs in a little while and why there are some challenges with that one. Now, the other side of things is those MPLS costs. The challenge that we have with that is that it was fine when only 5 or 10% of my workforce was remote, and I could backhaul them and I could manage that. However, when the pandemic hit, that went from 5 to 10% to 90 to 95%. So all of a sudden, I had a real issue in terms of congestion and that connectivity and all of those connectivity challenges, and then the performance challenges. So I started making compromises. Maybe I started bypassing my SSL inspection box because it couldn't handle the load. Maybe I had to bump up the cost of my MPLS as well. And by bumping that up, that adds extra operational cost for a scenario we don't know when and how we're coming out of the back end of. So there's some real challenges in that legacy hub and spoke model. So how do we do this? Well, this is really where SASE comes in. And whilst Zscaler is an incredibly SASE product, it's got great attitude, but it is not quite the SASE we're talking about. We're talking about Secure Access Service Edge. And this is a Gartner framework. It is a series of pieces of advice that Gartner deliver in order to create a comprehensive and cohesive security posture in today's cloud world and in the way that IT is now being consumed. So what Zscaler did is Zscaler created a SASE cloud. A SASE cloud acts and sits in the middle of the road as a little bump that the user then connects to. So they connect to that service edge cloud. They then are proxied through that cloud up into whatever application they need to access. So whether that's O365 or anything else, they are proxied, and it is a true proxy inline multi-tenant architecture that allows us to do that. It allows us then to build a whole series of capabilities into that. So secure web gateways, CASB, firewall as a service, ZTNA, all into that one cloud location. And that cloud location sits at all times between the user and what they're trying to access, regardless of where that user is. So in that way, we provide that consistent security experience for that user, regardless of where they connect, how they connect, or what they connect to. And that's really one of the benefits we have in that Office 365 world. So 3 core tenets. I'm not going to ask you to read the SASE framework from Gartner. It is widely available on the Zscaler website if you wish to download it. But 3 core principles that are vitally important when dealing with Office 365 in this way. First of all, put compute power at the edge. So the way that Gartner termed this is thin branch, heavy cloud. Or I say branch light, cloud heavy. I think the analogy works a little better. But put that compute power as close to the endpoint as you possibly can. Minimize the amount of hardware in those branches, both from a point of view of management, deployment cost, and everything else, but also just stick a router in there and push them out to the cloud. No matter who connects through that router will get the same levels of protection. And then also the final piece, and this is absolutely vital, inspect everything, especially SSL. I think it's about 90% of all traffic on the internet is SSL nowadays. And SSL appliances are very, very pushed to keep up with the amount of traffic that's coming through them. Again, this is where compromises start to get made. Once you start making those compromises, then you're opening yourself up for problems. You are increasing your attack surface. You are turning a blind eye to possible problems. So it's very important that you adopt these in any form of SASE journey that you're going to be taking. So on to the second one, bypassing proxies. So have a look at the bypassing proxies. And the reason we say this is that Office 365 is absolutely hungry for connections. Outlook alone creates in the region of 20 connections for every single user. And if you're backhauling all of those users into a data center and pushing them out through your firewalls are going to get overloaded very, very quickly. It will exhaust those firewalls. And those connections aren't short term. They sit around, they hang around. So, and that's just for Outlook. Now, when you start making connections for the Office suite, when you start making connections for SharePoint Online or OneDrive or Skype, then those connections are also incredibly strong and persistent. Microsoft Office also works across all ports and all protocols. So it's not just web traffic anymore. You are not just firing web traffic through this firewall. You are firing just about everything you can think of. And all of that impacts your end users. When your firewall can't keep up, it will disconnect, it will hang, it will prevent that user having the experience that they need and that they deserve. So it's very important to assess that and look at that load. Thirdly, identifying and differentiating Office 365. So this is the split and separate. Microsoft are wonderful people. They really are. We have a very, very strong and a very close relationship with Microsoft. Satya Nadella himself talks about the importance of SASE and Zscaler as part of that cloud security journey. However, Office 365 loves updating its connection details, and it does so a lot, multiple times a week. What that means for your guys is they're going to be managing those updates, those changes in terms of addresses, locations, URLs, all of those things have to be managed, have to be updated, have to be accounted for, and have to be reported and monitored and audited. Zscaler has worked on deep integration into Office 365. And so we fingerprint all of those applications. We automate the updates and the keeping up with all of those URL and IP changes. In fact, we actually have a full one-click configuration engine inside of the Zscaler ZIA product in order to take all of those headaches away from you. And we automatically configure the whitelist, so we exempt that Office 365 from authentication and SSL decryption, which again is recommended by Microsoft. It's all about delivering that performance and improving that performance. Now, what we're also able to do is look at, is through our API integration, improve the performance of downloads. Okay, the way that Zscaler connects and the way that Zscaler manages and owns those connections enables us to do this. We're not going to go too deep into this today. Don't worry about that. But the important point here is that the way that Zscaler scales and it opens a bigger window and it pre-negotiates the connections through being that inline cloud proxy at massive scale, that allows us to scale the TCP much more effectively. What that means is we get to download those large SharePoint files and those OneDrive files much faster. Okay, so a better user experience. Users aren't waiting anymore for the files to come down. What that means is they don't then shadow IT by saving them to their local devices where you're maybe in less control, or they don't save them, or they can collaborate far better and far more effectively. Okay, so the final part of that is the prioritization. We spoke about separating that traffic out. We spoke about prioritizing that traffic. And this is where this comes in. So what you might have, or what you have inside of Zscaler, is the ability to set the relative bandwidth. And again, this is relative, so this is percentage-based setting of the traffic. And you get to do this on a global basis. So what we can always say and what we always recommend is that your Office 365 is guaranteed 40% of your bandwidth at all times. Okay, now that is dynamic, so that will change as demand dictates, but Office 365 is always guaranteed a minimum of 40%. As I build out this slide, that will become clear. Okay, there we go. So we identify Office 365 as business critical. It's a recommendation that Microsoft makes. Naturally, it's a recommendation that we make. It is that collaboration tool that every single user in your environment uses. Okay, now we define that bandwidth management centrally, and it is immediately enforced globally. So again, I'm not having to go into multiple locations if that's how I work and that's how my organization is set up, and set this for each organization on each outgoing appliance or gateway and manage my bandwidth in a complex and long-winded way. I simply go to one location and I say, Office is important, give it 40% bandwidth, off we go. That gets applied immediately. Okay. I think my internet clicker is having some issues. So again, policies from Zscaler are enforced in the cloud. Okay, so Zscaler has 150 data centers spread all over the world in most of the major locations, and those data centers are stuffed full of what we call Zen nodes, Zscaler enforcement nodes. They are boxes and boxes of CPU and memory. No data is ever stored in the Zscaler cloud. It is simply a bump in the wire, as we said earlier. But what those boxes do is they take all of that traffic, massively load balance against it, and all the policies are applied on those enforcement nodes. That's what they enforce, policies. By doing that in the cloud, you are not having to do that in that last mile bottleneck, because let's face it, the connections between data centers and between clouds are much, much bigger than what you're going to get into your environment in that last mile, especially now your users are at home and using home connectivity. As much as BT and as much as all of the connectivity providers are talking about speeds of 100 megasecond and 60 and 70 megasecond, that's fractions of what you're going to get between data centers and between clouds. So applying those policies in the cloud will make, again, for a much smoother user experience. So the only way to do this is with a fully inline cloud proxy. And that's exactly what Zscaler is. It was built to be cloud native. We were cloud from the ground up. We weren't an old appliance vendor that virtualized appliances and popped them in the cloud and spoke about having a cloud offering that way. We were built in the cloud for the cloud as a cloud. And that's a very important thing, because it's not retrofitting architectures and tech debt and all of those kind of things. It is built to be natively cloud enabled. we saw very early back in 2012 that the world was going this way, and we made a bet, and that bet seems to be paying off so far. It's wonderful. So fourth and finally, in the last 5 minutes or so that we have left, we'll talk about avoiding those network hairpins. And again, this is where we start to come into the differences between Zscaler and some of the other solutions out on the market. Okay, not all clouds are connected and made the same. As JP said, not all fences are the same. Not all clouds are the same either. Some rain on you, some snow on you, and others are just high up in the sky and nice, white, fluffy, and maybe shaped like animals. The difference we're talking about here, however, is not the shape of the cloud, but the location of the cloud. So again, we have our destination clouds. So we could class AWS or Azure or GCP or even Oracle Cloud as a destination cloud. It is a cloud where my workloads are running, where my virtual appliances are running, and what I connect to. And we can do that. We typically do that through on-ramps. Okay, so AWS and Microsoft have direct on-ramps, fast paths, and all of those kind of things. And we go all the way up into the destination cloud. We process the information, we pass it back through that front door, and then we go out to the other cloud that we're really wanting to connect to, where our data and where our application is. And that's not particularly effective. Again, I'm hairpinning up and down through environments, and we're off out to where we want to be. Again, that doesn't help in terms of user experience. Whereas with a service edge cloud, you are that bump in the wire before we ever go through the on-ramp to the other cloud. It is about smart pathing. So doing smart pathing through the Zscaler cloud connects us to where we want to go, applies the policy, enforces that policy in line, and then connects us up to the O365 cloud. And that just means it's a much smoother, it's a much faster, and it's a much better user experience. So with that in mind, and just to recap, 4 steps to a successful and secure Office 365 deployment. Number 1, egress those network connections locally, whether that's with an SD-WAN vendor, and Zscaler has wonderful integrations with the SD-WAN providers out there, a lot of deep API integrations. Make sure that you egress those connections locally. Okay, break out straight into a global SASE cloud. And let's not beat about the bush, break out into the Zscaler cloud. Okay, don't backhaul your Office 365 traffic. Number 2, assess bypassing proxies. So don't trombone that Office 365 data up and down all of the security appliances in your perimeter. And yes, I know that they were great at the time and they're wonderful what they are for when people are in the office. We're just not there now. So don't do that. You'll ruin the performance. And let that elastic scale of 150 data centers spread all around the world take care of that computing and that processing requirement. Number 3, differentiate. Identify and differentiate Office 365 traffic. Split it out and separate it. Okay, so automate that security policy enforcement. Bypass the traffic that Office 365 would like you to bypass, and make sure that you're managing that egress bandwidth for maximum efficiency and optimal performance. And then 4th and finally, avoid those network hairpins. Okay, make sure that you've got your cloud as a fully inline service edge, a SASE cloud. Make sure that that is in place before we go out and we end up in a destination cloud and then coming all the way back and all the way back out again. Okay, and that covers the Zscaler presentation. So thank you very much. I know that there have been a couple of polls as we've gone through. Luke, what were the answers? In true Eurovision fashion, if you would.
I don't think I'm quite that good. So yeah, the second poll should be up on your screen now. So whilst we review the final results for the first one, please feel free to fill in the results for that. So a very high percentage of customers will be working remotely. So between 75 and 100% of a customer's workforce is likely to be working remotely, which if you rewind a year ago, I'd be quite surprised about, but nowadays, not quite surprised at all. Just a question to you on that. Do you see that in the next 12, 24, 36 months reversing, or do you kind of see it staying the same?
No, I don't think I do. I think it's now become a cultural shift. It's no longer a technology-driven argument. It's no longer a, can we do this? It's no longer a, yes, it would be a nice to have. I think it is now a true technology shift. It's become cultural. So people are expecting to be able to work from home now, and that was the key import. Where previously, and I lived through this, I don't think I've had an office for nearly 20 years now. It was always a fight to be allowed to work remotely. It was always a make a justification. Whereas I think now that that's changed, unless you seem to be Goldman Sachs or some of the wealth management companies who are determined to have everyone back in the office, I think for the vast majority of people, it will stay this way forever.
Yeah, I certainly agree. Definitely agree on that. So the second poll is actually in as well. Kind of a mixed result on the question around exploring changes to VPN or WAN connectivity. So nearly 30% of customers are. So expect that to be the kind of changes around the working landscape. 28% possibly, and 43% said no, not currently.
Oh, interesting. That is a slightly higher percentage that said no than I thought there would be. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first one is VPNs have had a real hammering in terms of exploits over the last few weeks and the few months. And it comes down to this adoption of ZTNA. Again, another acronym for us to all remember and understand, but Zero Trust Network Access. VPNs had a purpose and had a use where it was important to authenticate the user and drop them into a network. However, that allows, in the majority of cases, a lot of lateral movement. And that is exactly what we have found in any attack chain an attacker is looking for, is the ability to move laterally in a network. They don't want to go straight for the payload. What they're more likely to do is find a nice shady little corner of your infrastructure and sit there deploying all the tools they need. And what we've actually found through through Zscaler's own threat labs is that they don't then do anything else. They literally sit there and then they sell that access over to another organization and another crime syndicate that does want to do something, that does want to encrypt all your data and hold you to ransom and put the ransomware stuff in and that kind of thing. So there is an entire group of bad actors who are doing nothing more than breaking VPNs, installing a bunch of tools in a shady corner of the infrastructure, and then selling that access on. And there's been a number of exploits over the last few weeks and months talking specifically about that. So it's interesting in that way. And ZTNA says fundamentally, you cannot allow lateral movement inside of your network if you are going to subscribe to a ZTNA framework. So interesting commentary there.
Yeah, definitely. A couple of more questions. So does Zscaler fit into an SD-WAN strategy?
Oh, absolutely. We have very close relationships with the likes of Silver Peak and VeloCloud and all of the major SD-WAN vendors. Realistically, you should always be considering one with the other, so directly alongside. SD-WAN has been a wonderful thing for decomplicating or simplifying, I suppose is a better way of putting it, a less complicated way, in fact, of those complex network topologies, especially now that we are becoming so much more remote, yet so much more connected. On that front, you still have to have a high consideration of security. So moving that security layer up into the cloud and having that cloud know, regardless of where the users are, actually really enhances an SD-WAN deployment and gives you a lot more flexibility in what you wish to do with that SD-WAN deployment. So yeah, if you're not thinking about cloud security with an SD-WAN project, bluntly, you're kind of doing it wrong.
Straight to the point. I like it.
Oh, absolutely.
Another a great question here. So, can you differentiate between M365 traffic? So, in terms of bandwidth control between SharePoint, OneDrive, email, can you kind of differentiate between those applications within M365?
Yes, yeah. If you remember the very first chart that I had up, what you saw in there was Office traffic, and then you had some, I think there was some Skype traffic in there. There was some Microsoft deployment traffic. I'd have to throw up my presentation on the screen to remember exactly what they were. Let me just get that. Yeah, so we Visual Studio, Teams, Dynamics, Delve, and Office 365. Absolutely, all of that traffic is differentiated within Zscaler in terms of both reporting and the ability to control bandwidth around and control the access and the performance therein.
Perfect, thank you.
And the policies as well.
And just a question maybe from myself here. So SASE is used quite a lot in the industry at the moment, and the Gartner term.
Yep.
Where do you see customers starting on their journey around SASE, if they're kind of unsure what SASE means, or kind of to get the best value out of that terminology? Where's the starting point?
So two places. Firstly, I would start reading the Gartner SASE framework. Gartner has done years of research and analysis into this, and they've really written some nice papers. Secondly, if you're an end user looking, or if you're a CIO looking to start that, I'd really start it in two ways. I'd start it first by identifying my kind of enterprise risk strategy, and defining that by going on my enterprise risk journey. So that would be the first thing I do. But what I would always make sure is that I have a trusted partner like Bytes right there along every step of the way. Working with the Bytes team is going to give you access to an enormous number of products in a completely unbiased way. I mean, I'm from Zscaler. I'm wearing the polo shirt and everything. So of course I'm going to say that Zscaler is absolutely perfect. It will solve all your problems. And sorry, what was the question? Bytes are going to give you a slightly more balanced view than that, and they're going to really work out. Now, the other thing that is very, very important in this is to realize that security isn't one product. Security is an entire ecosystem of products, and that ecosystem has to be cohesive, and it has to be coherent all the way through. And again, that's where someone like a Bytes is really going to come in handy, combining a Mimecast with a Zscaler with some endpoint protection, like maybe a CrowdStrike. And that comprehensive journey is where you're really going to have to set the value. Think of it as a whole. Don't think of it as I have point problems and point solutions. So very important that way. That was a brilliant question, Luke.
Thank you very much. So that is all of our questions for today. Mike, really insightful presentation. I really enjoyed it. Definitely a lot of key takeaways there. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to go over the last couple of slides before we end today. More importantly, how Bytes can help, like Mike was going through just there. And then we can wrap up for the end of the day. So there are a number of assessments that we can help with, workshops. We've kind of listed a few on here, and there is a poll. If you're interested in any, just please tick the box where you're keen to have a conversation, or kind of email your account manager afterwards. But we have a number of assessments around email, so tackling it all from different angles. So what J.Peter was talking about with the zones. So we're looking at in the zone and out of the zone, and assessments on how also your kind of phishing susceptibility is between your users. So there's lots of different assessments we can help around email. So do please get in touch. And kind of touching or expanding on what Mike was saying around the Zscaler internet threat exposure analysis, and more importantly, the cyber security workshops, we can help really understand where you are potentially on that SASE journey, which points make sense most to you guys. Is it SD-WAN, is it the security, or are we kind of wrapping it all up and together into one bundle? And we can really understand that from our pre-sales team. So we can do proof of concept, set up lots of custom demos that support yourselves, as kind of says on the screen. And kind of more generic from a CIS controls gap analysis, we can do an assessment around that. So the top 20 CIS controls. It's a workshop to understand where you are today and where we can get you to in the future. So lots of different assessments. Please tick the box in terms of the ones you feel is relevant for you, and we'll be in touch. So the quick poll was around the assessments, so we'll get back to you. But yeah, that is it for the event today, and the events for the whole week. So thank you very much for everyone that has attended. I hope you have found it valuable. All of the recordings will be sent to you via email, and you can access them on our website, hopefully soon. So yeah, once again, thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoy your day.